Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we'll be discussing the survey of Minnesota childcare businesses that the Minneapolis Fed and First Children's Finance conducted a month ago. My name is Tu-Uyen Tran, and I write about the regional economy for the Minneapolis Fed. I'll be facilitating this event. This is the fifth year we've conducted the survey, and as in past years, we found that many childcare providers are struggling. What was surprising was that by many measures, the gap between childcare centers and family childcare providers have narrowed. Family providers are smaller, usually home-based businesses, and in past years, they have struggled much more than centers. This year, it seems like centers are struggling just as much as family providers. So what happened? My partner in the survey, Suzanne Pearl, will share our findings. Suzanne is an expert on the business side of childcare at First Children's Finance. Based in Minneapolis, First Children's Finance is a nonprofit and a community development financial institution that provides business training, consultation, and financing to childcare providers. First Children's also helps communities come together to ensure that childcare is available to support their local economies. Suzanne's presentation will last about 20 minutes. We've set aside the last 5 minutes for Q&A. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom app to leave a question at any time. I'll be tracking those and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Before we get started, I need to go over a few things. First, my views and Suzanne's are our own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, the Federal Reserve System, or its Board of Governors. Second, slides for this presentation and a copy of the video will be emailed to registered attendees later this week. We would also love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation. So please take a moment to fill out the 3-question survey at the end of the webinar. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Now here's Suzanne.
Thank you, Tu-Uyen, and good afternoon, everyone. Before we get into the survey results, here is some detail about who responded to our survey. As we have every year, we received a robust response from the childcare provider community. So I'd like to thank any childcare providers who may be listening in today or who might view the recording later. With regard to provider type, our survey respondents are a fairly reflective breakdown of statewide provider types with a slightly higher representation from family providers. With more than 600 responses, this survey represents roughly 8% of licensed childcare programs in Minnesota. Currently, there are about 7,500 licensed childcare providers in Minnesota. About 5,700 of those are licensed family childcare, and about 1,800 are childcare centers. The other category here would be Head Starts, preschools, or after-school programs. For those of you who are tracking childcare programs in Minnesota, the total number of licensed programs is down by about 300 since we did this survey last year, with most of that loss coming from licensed family childcare programs. Our regional breakdown is also fairly consistent with statewide licensing data, with Greater Minnesota slightly overrepresented in this survey, particularly when it comes to childcare centers located in Greater Minnesota versus licensing data. We heard from a lot more centers in Greater Minnesota. And please note that when we say metro or Twin Cities in this presentation, we're referring to the 7-county metro area. Of those providers who chose to report their racial ethnic identity, 9% identified as racial and ethnic minorities and 81% identified as white. One thing to keep in mind is that our survey went to childcare business leadership, family childcare business owners, or center directors and owners. The broader childcare workforce, which includes classroom teachers and teachers' aides, is a much more diverse group. Finally, you can see from the information to the right, the vast majority of our respondents, 96%, are women. Let's see what we found out this year. As many of you know, the childcare sector is regulated by the state through licensing. There are statutory limits on how many children of different age groups providers can care for. Childcare programs must comply with these ratios to stay in compliance. Because childcare programs must always be mindful of the balance of ages of kids in their care, it's fairly difficult, particularly for childcare centers, to maintain 100% enrollment as kids of different ages age in and out of different classrooms through the year. Realistically, most childcare programs, particularly centers, operate at 85% of capacity. This year, we wanted to test that number a bit, so we asked providers not only for their enrollment, which is the blue columns, but also their currently open slots, the orange sections. And you can see that most providers consider their operational capacity to be around 90% of licensed capacity. We've broken this information down by provider type and region. Looking at the blue columns here to show enrollments against all licensed capacity, centers statewide are operating at about 73% of capacity, which is below expected, but is an improvement over last year when they were operating at 66% capacity. Family child care providers in our survey are about the same as last year, operating close to 80%. So we are seeing some fairly full programs in licensed family child care. Looking at the regional breakdown, which includes all provider types, programs in the metro are at about 70% capacity and programs in greater Minnesota are at 77% capacity. The greater Minnesota figure is down a bit from last year when it was 83%. In this year's survey, we asked providers to share enrollment changes by age type: infants, toddlers, preschool, and school age. For each age, we asked if enrollment decreased, increased, or remained stable. For all ages and provider types, the majority of respondents reported stable enrollment. This is certainly true for infants and toddlers, with only 13% of family providers and 20% of centers reporting decreased enrollment for those ages. We do see a higher rate of decreases across provider types in preschool and school age enrollment. 34% of both family providers and centers report reduced enrollment of preschool age children and around 25% for school age. This is important because enrollment of older children is often how child care programs are able to stay financially viable. The cost of providing infant care, in particular, is higher than providers can reasonably pass on to parents. So often these businesses utilize a mix of pricing by age groups so that tuition from older children often serves as a sort of subsidy for the younger ones. And when those older children leave programs, providers have a hard time breaking even with the remaining enrollment. Again, this year, we wanted to get a better idea of what child care providers are learning from the families they serve, particularly those who may be taking their children out of child care. We asked providers if they had direct information from families about why they were leaving child care. The orange lines here are responses from child care centers, and the blue lines are responses from family child care providers. First off, let's look at a difference between centers and licensed family child care. At the bottom of this table, only 5% of center respondents said that no families left their program last year, but nearly 40% of licensed family child care reported that no families left their program. Moving back to the top of the table, 59% of centers said that families moved out of their geographical area, and 18% of family providers reported the same. Both are significantly higher than last year by 8 to 10 percentage points. So we've got some relocation happening in our workforce. And I should say that this was reported more by metro providers as opposed to those in greater Minnesota. We've got some interesting indicators about affordability here too. 50% of centers had direct knowledge of families leaving their program because they couldn't afford it, and just under 30% told us that families left because parents left the workforce to stay home. One last point on this slide that may relate to what we saw in the previous slide about preschool age enrollment. For the past few years, we've had a lot of providers comment in our survey that they're concerned about the increase in school-based programs and about families leaving both centers and family childcare programs to move their children to school-based programs. In the middle of this chart, you can see that 17% of family programs and 45% of centers reported direct knowledge of a family leaving their program for a school-based program. The center figure is a significant increase, up from 13% last year to 45% this year. To be clear, there is a shortage of childcare availability in Minnesota, and it's a good thing to create more childcare slots across many different care delivery types, particularly at lower to no cost for families. That's a very good thing for those families. We hear from providers, however, that they are at a competitive disadvantage, as school-based programs often have lower overhead and operational costs because those can be shared with the schools. And again, as I mentioned in the last slide, the loss of the older children from childcare businesses can mean that those businesses may lose financial viability and not be able to remain open to serve infants and toddlers. As we've done each year with the survey, we'll spend a little time discussing workforce issues. While many family programs do have an employee, a helper, working in their program, for the next couple of slides, we're going to focus on childcare centers, particularly on staffing and how that impacts childcare availability. While the labor market overall may have eased a bit from the past few years, we are still seeing centers have difficulty in hiring qualified staff. We're showing responses to this question over the past 3 years, asking how easy or difficult it has been to find qualified employees. You can see how colorful the left side of the this graph is to indicate very difficult when it comes to finding staff. I was thinking about what text to include on this slide and successfully fought the urge to write, "Yep, still bad," but apparently I couldn't fight the urge to say it. Given the difficulty in hiring, centers are trying their best to improve compensation and benefits, and they are receiving support from the state of Minnesota to do just that. You have all heard a lot about how childcare is not a well-compensated job. Our organization did a childcare cost modeling report in 2023 that showed that hourly salaries for teaching staff at centers across the state range from around $13 an hour to around $19 an hour. During COVID, Minnesota used pandemic-related federal funds to provide support to childcare programs to help with expenses, including compensation. Once those funds ended, the state decided to continue that program on an ongoing basis using state funds. The Great Start Compensation Support Payment Program has been in operation for about a year and a half now, and that has been a very welcome financial support for this workforce. This slide shows the types of compensation incentives that centers were able to provide to staff during the last year. The second bar shows that 91% were able to offer an hourly wage increase, which is likely linked to the Great Start payments. There is also a high rate of paid time off, discounted childcare, and bonus pay. Interestingly, there has been a drop in how many respondents report offering health insurance, 38% this year, down from 55% last year. Respondents that offer hiring bonuses also dropped from 43% last year to 19% this year. And what does it mean when a center has difficulty hiring staff? As I mentioned earlier, the state limits how many children of different age groups can be cared for by an adult. A center may be licensed to care for perhaps 75 or 100 kids, but if they don't have enough staff in place to meet the ratios required for each age group, they can't operate at their licensed capacity. Over the past couple of years, we've seen many centers operating with empty classrooms. They have the space, they just don't have the people. Those empty classrooms, those unfilled childcare slots, are the result of difficulties in hiring or retaining staff and have a real tangible impact on the availability of childcare for Minnesota families. Last year, we showed how open teaching staff positions at centers equated to a lack of available childcare, and we're revisiting that data and are including it here with this year's responses. 54% of our survey respondents reported their current enrollment is limited due to lack of staff. This table shows the percentage of unfilled childcare slots compared with total enrollment across the metro and greater Minnesota. The orange lines are responses from this year's survey. The first thing you might notice is that centers in the metro are more likely to report unfilled slots due to lack of staffing. This may be due to more and more types of jobs available in the metro area market. The percentage of centers in greater Minnesota reporting open slots due to staffing is largely the same as last year. The survey data showed 215 open teaching positions in total from our survey respondents, resulting in 1,745 unavailable childcare slots. Recall that our survey respondents make up about 8% of the childcare sector, so if these are the real numbers just from our survey respondents, it's possible to consider that the actual number of unfilled childcare slots due to lack of staff is much, much larger across the state. Shifting away from childcare center workforce issues and looking now at both childcare centers and licensed family childcare providers, let's look at how childcare businesses manage revenue and expenses. I talked about enrollment earlier, and that enrollment is the main driver of a program's revenue through tuition. Every year we've done this survey, we've asked whether providers increase tuition. You can see in 2021, 22, 23, and 24, a steady increase in childcare centers reporting raising tuition. That percentage actually went down slightly this year, but still 86% of childcare centers reported raising their tuition. The number of licensed family childcare respondents, represented here in blue, who reported tuition increases actually went down this year after increasing over the previous few years. Even so, nearly half of family providers report increasing tuition. While most childcare revenue comes from tuition, which can be private pay or supplemented through programs like childcare assistance payments, also known as CCAP, or early learning scholarships, there are different types of state-funded grant supports available as well. You can see that about 90% of all childcare providers in our survey report participating in the new Great Start Compensation Support Program that I mentioned earlier. Our survey also asked providers about the sustainability of compensation they are currently offering to staff. There was a fairly stark drop-off in the responses from child care center directors. In the 2024 survey, 47% answered that the compensation they can offer staff is stable. But in 2025, that dropped to 26%. While the Great Start compensation support payments are meant to be a permanent part of the state's support of the childcare sector, we've heard from a number of center directors that they are nervous about the level of funding that may be available in future years. In fact, this was discussed in a House committee yesterday with the acknowledgement that the funding level for this program will likely go down. One other interesting piece of data regarding the Great Start Compensation Support Payment Program. We asked if providers agreed with the statement, "Receiving these payments has helped to stabilize my business." 98% of family providers agreed, which really shows the impact of the program, but only 59% of center directors agreed. The Great Start funds are different for centers than the pandemic-era child care stabilization grants. Centers could use the previous grants to help with many different operational costs, but the Great Start payments are limited to compensation. We've heard from respondents that they miss the flexibility of the previous system and that the Great Start payments are essentially a pass-through to their staff. While they appreciate that they are better able to attract and retain staff, they are left with a lack of funding support for all of the other operational costs that go into running a childcare center. A good number of providers have been able to access other grant programs as well, as you can see from the bottom of the table. There is a good amount of parity in access to Child Care Aware and FCF grants between centers and family providers, though you can see that centers report a much higher rate of accessing other available philanthropic or local grant programs. This is not surprising given that child care centers usually include some level of staff that provide administration support. Family child care providers are their own administrative support and can have more barriers to accessing capital. As we make our way through the childcare business model, let's move from revenue to expenses. We asked providers about their expenses. The list here shows the major area of expenses for a childcare business: food, payroll, insurance, facility costs, transportation, supplies, learning materials. We asked providers whether they've experienced decreases, increases, or stability in those areas. The responses here are solely those who indicated significant increase. And to probably no one's surprise, the vast majority of providers reported significant increases in the cost of food. Other notable responses here show that half of centers report a significant increase in payroll. This should be a good sign for the childcare workforce, as much of this is likely due to the Great Start Compensation Payment Program. Finally, I'll note that if you just take a quick look at this table, nearly every category has a response between 30% or more of responses who report significant increase for that category. And it could be difficult to realize efficiency or savings in these areas. This is the facility in which your child spends their days, the food that they have access to for lunch, the toys that they play with, or the salary to pay the childcare staff. I do want to take a minute to call out one expense in particular that we've been hearing about quite a bit, particularly in the last year, and that is a childcare program's cost of or even ability to secure business liability insurance. For the moment, this seems to have the most impact on childcare centers as well as in the metro, as opposed to greater Minnesota. 37% of centers, up from 16% last year, report difficulty in securing liability insurance. We received some startling information in the comments to our survey. One center director noted that their insurance went up 16% in 2023, 27% in 2024, and 51% in 2025. They have never filed claims against their coverage. Another provider, this time a licensed family childcare provider, said their premiums have gone up from $1,400 a few years ago to nearly $5,000. Again, they never made a claim. We've also heard from providers who want to offer more flexible hours for families, but they can't get coverage for evening hour care, for example. Others can only obtain coverage if they serve a certain number of children, which might be below their license capacity. This is something we're going to continue to watch, particularly as more childcare programs will have their policies come up for renewal. So how does a childcare business manage their cash flow to account for the rising costs? While I noted earlier that it's difficult to reduce expenses, about 24% of providers report doing that. 15% resorted to reaching into their business emergency funds. We also see that center directors are starting to resort to more financing options than in previous years. 11% reported taking out a loan, and another 11% reported utilizing high interest financing, which we frame as credit cards or payday loans. Both of these figures for centers are twice as high as they were last year. We can also see how many childcare providers also rely on their personal finances to cash flow their business. 16% of providers said they had to use either personal savings or even retirement funds last year, and 23% of all providers said that they were unable to pay themselves at times last year. Following that same line of reaching into personal savings or foregoing a salary, we have some information about how many childcare providers report that their business has an impact on their own household income. Like most small business owners, childcare business owners often find that the financial health of their business is entwined with their personal finances. This slide shows the answer to this question over all 5 years of the survey. While we had been seeing a steady improvement here for childcare owners and directors, this year 45% of center directors reported an adverse impact on their household income, up from 25% last year. And the yes answers to this question continues to be even higher for licensed family childcare with more than half of family providers reporting an adverse impact on their household income every year of the survey, still about 50% of respondents. So with all of the financial difficulties that can go along with owning a childcare business, each year we've asked childcare providers how long they thought they could stay in business. And while we'd seen some improvement over the past couple of years, this year we see that center directors are vocalizing much less certainty about how long they can stay in business. 42% of center directors aren't sure how long they can continue. They've joined now the level of uncertainty that has been fairly consistent among licensed family childcare providers in Minnesota. For our last couple of slides today, I'd like to share something that we started with last year's survey. We wanted to see if we could more qualitatively capture how childcare providers feel, not only about their business finances, but about the childcare sector overall and about support for that sector. We're sharing this year's responses compared to last year's. The survey presented some statements and asked if providers agreed. The first statement is, my state is making investments to increase childcare subsidy for low-income children. 51% of centers said yes, which is down from 80% last year. Licensed family childcare agreement dropped to this question from 44% to 34%. We see very similar response rates to the statement, my state is effectively providing financial support to my business to increase teachers' wages. Family childcare agreement with this statement stayed fairly static at about 33%. Center director agreement with that statement has dropped from 70 to 58%. Center director responses to these two statements are interesting, as we know that nearly 100% of center respondents are receiving Great Start compensation support payments. And the state did increase childcare assistance program funds for low-income children. It could be that what we're seeing here is a demonstration of overall pessimism in the sector. Finally, we asked if providers agreed that Minnesota is making investments that are increasing the sustainability of childcare businesses, with 35% of family providers in agreement and just over 50% of center directors. Again, both are down from last year. So we've heard from survey respondents, but also FCF's clients across the state. Some of them are doing better, and many of them are not. It may be that there is a realization that for many providers who are serving many different communities across the state, the childcare business model still just doesn't work. It won't be surprising that there is now near agreement in the percentage of family providers and the percentage of center directors who are optimistic about the future of their businesses, with both types at just over 40%. This is down from last year, but given the data that we've shared, 40% could be considered to be quite positive. You can see from the bottom half of the table that over 80% of both provider types agree with the statement that the childcare business is in crisis. And as we've been discussing, there's a jump this year in the response rate from centers. This year's survey was really interesting. I think we see very clearly that while we continue to have concerns about the reduction of licensed family childcare programs across the state, we're starting to see a much higher percentage of our childcare centers being concerned for their financial viability as well. There have been several high-profile center closures around the state, and we've learned that there is concern from those remaining in business. However, while the business side of childcare can be a real struggle, we hear all the time from childcare providers that they love their work. They love the kids in their care and the families they serve. And they understand very well how important childcare is, not only to those families, but to the rest of us in Minnesota and to the health of our state's economy. Hopefully, we'll see a more positive trend when we do this survey again next year. With that, here is contact information for both Tu-Uyen and myself, as well as First Children's Finance and the Minneapolis Fed. Please feel free to reach out to either of us directly with any questions you might have. We have time now for a few questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. Please type any questions you have in the chat function in Zoom, but I'm going to start with this one. Somebody wanted to, I'm going to scroll up here. Now, why do you think this year had more respondents from Greater Minnesota? That's the first question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I am not sure about that. You may have, if you were here last year, you may have noticed a decline overall in the number of our respondents. There is a lot of surveying going on in the childcare field right now. There are different initiatives at the state, and I think there might be a little bit of survey fatigue among the provider community. That said, I'm not sure why we overrepresented a little bit from Greater Minnesota.
Another questioner says, do we know why enrollment picked up from last year to this year? Are we seeing a similar increase in labor force participation in the state, for example?
I'm not going to be able to answer the question about labor participation in the state. I do think there are some, even though hiring is difficult, we have seen some stabilization in centers being able to attract staff largely with support of the Great Start Compensation Payment Program. I think a lot of programs are able to expand and open up classrooms that may have been shut over the past few years. So I'm going to guess that that's probably causing the increase in enrollment.
Did survey respondents mention changes to immigration policies as a concern for future teacher hiring?
That is a good question. I do not recall seeing any comments in the survey, but I do know that is something that we have heard from several of our clients at First Children's Finance.
Are new centers still starting? Same question for family providers.
Yes, and which is a wonderful miracle, I think, given the difficulty. And I'm always a bit chastened whenever I say in public that, childcare is in crisis, because I don't want to discourage people from coming into the sector. We need you. We need your love for kids, and we need your desire to run these programs. So yes, we are seeing people interested. It can be a great small business. It's just about making sure that these new providers have the level of support they need to succeed.
We are at the mark, but we can continue to answer questions if anybody wants. And there was a question about if we could email the PowerPoint, and we will do that. But I'll continue if you guys want to stick around. And Suzanne, you're okay with answering some additional questions?
Sure.
What is your read on reduced confidence? Oh, somebody just asked a new question. Now I can't see it. Excuse me. What is your read on reduced confidence in the state investments as it relates to the new federal administration?
What is my read on?
The reduced confidence in the state's investments as it relates to the new federal administration. I think what they're wondering is whether people are just scared that the state's getting less money, so they're not able to fund the programs for childcare.
Yeah, and the answer is, I don't know. We don't know. we're all in a bit of a wait and see period. And I trust that as soon as we, as soon as the state learns something, we'll learn something as well. But in the meantime, we're just, moving forward as we can.
Are you in conversations with leaders about the impact of public schools and private centers?
This is a pretty in-depth conversation at a lot of levels. And I do believe that the state of Minnesota, both the administration, the DCYF, the agency, the legislature, want to make sure that any new childcare slots are not unintentionally having an adverse impact on existing childcare slots. It's really a matter of information, informing about the business model. I had a conversation with somebody a few years ago who was excited that, or was running a school-based program, and they were, attracting preschool and school-age kids, and they were asked, "Well, are you worried about the impact on the child care center down the road who has infants and toddlers?" And they said no, because they don't, the older kids, they don't get as much tuition. But what they, probably didn't know is that childcare businesses have to have a mix of all levels of tuition, because if they were only going to charge the cost of infant care to a family with infants, nobody could afford it. So it really is a matter of just further discussion and education, and how can we support existing childcare businesses while adding needed childcare slots.
What kind of political support exists for subsidizing childcare providers in order to improve wages and benefits for faculty and decrease cost to parents?
I'd say there's quite a bit of political will, and that is in a very bipartisan approach. I think I can say that. Both, there has been, I was in a couple of hearings yesterday where members of both parties were talking about, how do we make this business work better? I think like all, every part of government funding, we're running up against priorities. But I do believe this is a high priority for leaders in the state.
And this is going to be our last question. Is there any indication that districts that are partnering with childcare to utilize their VPK funds?
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I wish I did, but I just don't know.
Okay, thank you again for joining us. More information will be in our follow-up email to this event. So please remember to fill out the 3-question survey that will pop up in your Zoom window upon exiting. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day.